The white papers fell like strange snow through the gray November sky. Private Werner Holtz watched them drift between the shattered trees of the Hurtgen forest, spinning slowly down toward the mud and blood below. He pressed himself deeper into the foxhole, his empty stomach cramping, his fingers blue against the cold metal of his rifle. 3 weeks without reinforcements. 2 days without hot food. And now this, paper falling from American planes, carrying words more dangerous than bombs. Werner reached out and caught one of the leaflets before it touched the mud. The paper was clean and white, impossibly clean for this place where everything was brown with filth and red with suffering. On one side, a photograph showed German soldiers sitting at tables in an American prisoner camp. They were eating real food on real plates. Their faces showed something Werner had almost forgotten existed: relief. On the other side, words in perfect German promised safe passage, medical treatment, and survival. At the bottom, in bold letters, "This leaflet is your safe conduct pass. Put that down." Sergeant Klaus Brenner appeared above the foxhole, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He was 34 years old but looked 50, his face carved by 3 years of war, his eyes holding the terrible patience of a man who had seen too many soldiers die. Anyone caught reading American lies will face court-martial. Werner dropped the leaflet. It landed face up in a puddle, the photograph of the eating prisoners slowly dissolving into the water. But the image stayed in his mind. Those men looked alive. They looked like they might actually go home someday. The shelling started again at noon. Werner counted 15 explosions before he stopped counting. Somewhere to his left, a voice screamed for a medic that would never come. The company had lost its last medical officer 6 days ago to a sniper. Now the wounded simply waited, for evacuation that never arrived, for morphine that had run out, for death that came too slowly or too fast. By the time the shelling stopped, 3 more men were dead. Werner helped carry the bodies to the collection point behind the lines, a shallow pit covered with canvas where the dead waited for burial details that were weeks behind schedule. The frozen ground made digging impossible. The bodies stacked like firewood. That evening, Werner sat in the trench with Corporal Heinrich Vogel, who everyone called Haney. Before the war, Haney had been a baker in Bremen. He still talked about bread sometimes, the smell of it rising, the sound of crusts cracking in the oven. Now he smelled only cordite and rot, and the only sounds were artillery and dying. "I kept one," Haney whispered. He opened his boot and showed Werner a folded leaflet, dry and hidden. "Don't tell Brenner." Werner said nothing. He understood. They all understood. The leaflets were not just paper. They were a question that the German High Command could not answer. What if the war is already lost? What if fighting is just a slower way to die? The youngest soldier in the company was Emil Roth, 19 years old, from a small village near Munich. Emil still believed in victory because the alternative was too terrible to imagine. His father had told him that surrender meant slavery, that the Americans would ship them all to Siberia, that death was preferable to capture. Emil repeated these things like prayers, but his voice grew quieter each day. Night fell like a black curtain over the forest. The temperature dropped below freezing. Werner huddled in his foxhole, wrapped in a wet blanket that provided no warmth. Above him, stars appeared through gaps in the clouds, the same stars that shone over Cologne, where his family's home had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. He had nowhere to go home to. He fought because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering everything he had lost. At midnight, the loudspeakers started. American voices drifted across the frozen forest, speaking German with strange accents. They played music first, old songs from before the war, songs Werner's mother used to sing. Then a calm voice read names. German names. Soldiers who had surrendered and were now safe in American camps. The voice said these men would see their families again. The voice said the war was ending. The voice asked a simple question: why die for a cause that is already defeated? Sergeant Brenner walked the trench line, ordering men to cover their ears. But the voice was patient. It came every night now. It spoke truths that no German officer would admit. It offered something the Wehrmacht could not provide, hope. Werner did not cover his ears. He listened until the voice stopped and the forest returned to silence. Then he pulled out a small notebook he had kept hidden since training, and by the light of a single match, he wrote down everything the voice had said. Somewhere in the darkness, Haney asked a question that none of them could answer. Do you think any of it is true? Werner closed his notebook. He did not know. But for the first time in months, he wanted to find out. The field kitchen took a direct hit on the 7th day. Werner watched it burn from his position in the trench. 3 weeks of rations, the last of the coffee, the cooking pots that had somehow survived since France. Gone in a single explosion that painted the gray sky orange for one brief, terrible moment. Now the men ate cold rations from dented cans, scraping frozen meat with numb fingers, drinking melted snow that tasted like ash and mud. 8 men dead since the Leaflet started falling. No replacements. No mail. No word from command except a single order delivered by a runner who looked barely old enough to shave, hold position for 3 more weeks. Reinforcements en route. The runner left before anyone could ask him questions he could not answer. That night, the American loudspeakers brought something new. A German voice, not an American reading from a script, but a real German, speaking with the accent of Hamburg or maybe Bremen. The voice introduced itself as Sergeant Richter, formerly of the 352nd Infantry Division, now a prisoner of the United States Army. He said he had surrendered near Aachen 6 weeks ago. He said he was alive. He said he was treated with dignity. Then Sergeant Richter read a letter. A letter from a captured German soldier to his mother in Dusseldorf. The words floated across the frozen battlefield, intimate and devastating. Mama, I am safe. They feed us 3 times a day. There are doctors here. I will come home when this madness ends. Please do not believe what they tell you about the Americans. They are soldiers like us. They want to go home too. Werner watched Brenner's face as the letter was read. The sergeant stood motionless at the edge of the trench, his jaw tight, his hands gripping his rifle until his knuckles turned white. Brenner had ordered the men to ignore the broadcasts. He had threatened punishment for anyone caught listening. But he listened now. They all listened. The next morning, Brenner's temper broke. He caught Emil Roth hesitating during a patrol, freezing behind a fallen tree when he should have been advancing. Brenner hit him across the face with an open hand, then again with a closed fist. Emil fell into the mud, blood streaming from his nose, and did not get up. He lay there staring at the gray sky, and Werner saw something die in the young man's eyes, not his body, but his faith. Haney helped Emil back to the trench. He cleaned the blood from Emil's face with a rag that was already brown with other men's blood. He spoke softly about his wife, about the bakery, about the child he had never met. My daughter was born in April, Haney said. I have a photograph, but I have never held her. I promised my wife I would come home. I didn't promise her I would win. On the 9th night, a soldier named Dieter Fischer made his choice. Werner never knew what broke him. Perhaps it was the hunger, or the cold, or the letter from Hamburg that the loudspeakers had read. Perhaps it was simply that Dieter had stopped believing in anything except the desire to survive. Whatever the reason, Dieter walked out of the trench at midnight, carrying a leaflet above his head, moving toward the American lines that he made it 30 meters before the shot came. Not from the American side. From behind. From Brenner's rifle. Dieter fell face first into the mud, the leaflet still clutched in his dead hand, his safe conduct pass turned red with blood. Brenner called it desertion. The men called it nothing. They said nothing at all. They looked at Brenner with eyes that held fear and something else, something that might have been hate, or might have been understanding. In war, there was often no difference between the two. 3 nights later, the American voice mentioned Dieter by name. It said he had been trying to surrender. It said a German sergeant had shot him in the back. It asked a question that echoed through every foxhole and every frozen heart: how many more of you will they shoot for wanting to live? Werner wrote everything in his notebook. The names of the dead. The words from the loudspeakers. The look on Brenner's face after he pulled the trigger. He did not know if anyone would ever read these pages. He only knew that someone had to remember what happened here, in this forest where paper fell from the sky and men died for the crime of hoping. Emil stopped eating after Dieter died. Haney started talking about walking across, about the light on the American side, about the letters that promised survival. And Brenner patrolled the trench line like a ghost, watching for the next man who might try to leave, his rifle always ready, his eyes empty of everything except duty. The loudspeakers played music again that night. Old German songs. Songs from before the war. Songs that reminded every man of home. 14 men remained. Werner counted them each morning as if the number might change through some miracle, as if the dead might climb out of the collection pit and pick up their rifles again. But the number only went down, never up. 14 souls in a trench that had once held 50, waiting for reinforcements that existed only in the lies of distant commanders. The trench system was collapsing. Shell craters had torn through the support beams, and the walls of frozen mud sagged inward like the ribs of a dying animal. The men slept in shifts, 2 hours at a time, curled into hollows carved from the earth, dreaming of warmth and food and faces they were starting to forget. Some had stopped writing letters. There was nothing left to say that would not break the hearts of those waiting at home. Sergeant Brenner had not slept in 4 days. Werner watched him pace the line like a machine running on fumes, checking positions, adjusting equipment, speaking in clipped sentences that grew shorter with each passing hour. On the 5th day without sleep, Brenner began confiscating personal items. Letters. Photographs. A small wooden cross that Private Muller had carried since his confirmation. Distractions, Brenner said. Personal attachments weaken the soldier. We must think only of duty. No one argued. Arguing required energy that none of them had. They handed over their memories and watched Brenner pile them in an ammunition box, their last connections to the world outside this frozen hell sealed away like contraband. But at night, in the deepest part of the trench where the cold was worst and the shadows were thickest, the men gathered. They spoke in whispers so quiet that the words barely formed in the air. They talked about the leaflets. They debated whether the American promises were true or just another form of warfare. Some believed. Some doubted. All of them wanted desperately to be convinced. My father surrendered in the First War, said Private Lang, a thin man from Hanover who rarely spoke. He gave himself up to the British in 1918. They put him in a camp. They fed him. They let him write letters home. He came back in 1919 and married my mother. I exist because he surrendered. Lang paused, his voice cracking. Is that cowardice? Is my life a product of cowardice? No one answered. The question was too large for the small space where they sat. Werner became the keeper of these conversations. Men came to him with questions they could not ask anyone else. Not questions about tactics or orders or duty, but questions about meaning. Was it worth dying for a war that was already lost? Did surrender erase everything they had fought for? Would their families understand, or would they carry the shame forever? Werner had no answers. But he listened, and sometimes that was enough. One night, Brenner found Werner's notebook. He appeared at the edge of the foxhole like a ghost, his face pale in the moonlight, his hands trembling from cold or exhaustion or something deeper. He took the notebook without asking and read it by the light of a single match, page after page, his expression unreadable. When he finished, Brenner did not threaten court-martial. He did not confiscate the notebook. Instead, he asked a question that Werner would remember for the rest of his life: do you believe any of it? Werner thought carefully before answering. I believe they want us to surrender. I believe they think words can break us faster than shells. But I also believe. He hesitated. I believe the men in those photographs looked fed. I believe the voice on the loudspeaker sounded like my uncle from Hamburg. I believe that not everyone who kills us wants us dead. Brenner said nothing. He handed the notebook back and walked away into the darkness. Werner saw something in his eyes he had never expected to see in a man like Brenner. Doubt. Haney came to Werner that night with a decision already made. His voice was calm, almost peaceful, like a man who had finally stopped running from a truth he could not outpace. I am going to walk across tomorrow night. I have written a letter to my wife. If I do not make it, I need you to find a way to send it to her. Tell her I died walking home. Tell her I kept my promise. Werner took the letter. It was warm from being held against Haney's chest. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his notebook, between the pages where he had recorded the names of the dead. The loudspeaker crackled to life just before dawn. An American officer's voice, clear and calm, speaking directly to their position. He used their unit designation. He knew exactly where they were and how few remained. We know you are hungry. We know you are tired. There is no shame in survival. Tomorrow morning, we will hold our fire. If you want to live, walk toward the light. Werner looked at Brenner. The sergeant was listening. His rifle hung at his side. His eyes were fixed on the eastern horizon, where the first gray light of morning was beginning to show. He did not order the men to cover their ears. He did not threaten punishment. He simply listened, like a man hearing his own death sentence, or perhaps his salvation. The last night before the American deadline brought a silence more terrifying than any bombardment. The artillery had stopped. The machine guns were quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as 14 German soldiers sat in their crumbling trench and faced a question no military training could answer. Werner watched his comrades in the pale moonlight. Each man had retreated into himself, wrestling with a choice that would define whatever remained of his life. Some prayed, their lips moving without sound. Others stared at photographs they had hidden from Brenner, faces of wives and children and parents who might never know what happened in this frozen forest. One man, Private Schubert, simply wept, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. Brenner sat apart from the others, his back against the trench wall, his rifle across his knees. He had not spoken since the American broadcast. His eyes were fixed on some distant point that only he could see, and Werner understood that the sergeant was fighting a battle more vicious than anything the Americans could wage, a battle against himself. Haney found Werner as the stars began to fade. His voice was steady now, resolved. I have made my peace. Whatever happens when I stand up, I will die walking towards something instead of hiding from everything. He pressed a small object into Werner's hand, a wedding ring, worn thin from years of nervous touching. If I make it, I will come back for this. If I do not, please find a way to send it to her. Let her know I tried. Werner closed his fingers around the ring. It was still warm. Emil appeared beside them, his young face aged by weeks of terror and hunger. The bruises from Brenner's fists had faded to yellow shadows under his eyes. I am going too, he said. Not because I am brave. Because I am more afraid of dying here than dying out there. Is that wrong? No, Werner said. That is human. The first light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, painting the shattered trees in shades of gray and gold. Somewhere across the lines, an American soldier raised a white flag. It hung limp in the still air, a fragile promise against the brutality of everything that had come before. The loudspeaker crackled one final time, we are waiting. No one will fire. Come now. Haney moved first. He climbed out of the trench with the slow deliberation of a man walking through a dream, his leaflet held high above his head, his eyes fixed on the distant flag. His boots crunched on the frozen ground. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He expected the bullet at any moment, from the Americans, from Brenner, from the war itself, but no bullet came. Emil followed 10 paces behind, then Private Lang, then 2 more whose names Werner had written in his notebook. One by one, the men rose from the mud and walked toward the light, a procession of ghosts returning to the world of the living. Werner stood at the edge of the trench. He looked at Brenner one last time. The sergeant had not moved. His rifle was still in his hands, but his finger was not on the trigger. His eyes were wet. "Sergeant," Werner said. "The war will end without us. But we do not have to end with it." Brenner did not answer. He looked at the rifle in his hands as if seeing it for the first time, as if the weapon that had defined his entire adult life had suddenly become a stranger. Then he looked at the men walking across the field, his men, the soldiers he had trained and fed and watched die, now moving away from him toward an enemy that offered them something he never could. Werner did not wait for Brenner's decision. He climbed out of the trench and walked toward the American lines, the leaflet in one hand and his notebook in the other. The ground was frozen hard beneath his boots. The air smelled clean for the first time in weeks, no cordite, no rot, no death. Just cold November air and the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere behind the American positions. That he reached the American line expecting commands, searches, rough hands. Instead, a young soldier with tired eyes offered him a canteen. "Water," the American said in broken German. "Drink." Werner drank. The water was clean and cold and tasted like life itself. A medic examined his wounds, small cuts and frozen fingers and the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone could never cure. An officer asked his name, his unit, his rank. Werner answered in a voice that sounded strange to his own ears, like a man speaking from very far away. The voice on the loudspeaker, Werner asked. "Sergeant Richter. Is he here?" The officer smiled, a small human expression amid the machinery of war. "He will want to meet you. He always wants to meet the men who listened." Werner sat on an ammunition crate and ate bread that was soft and fresh, so different from the frozen rations of the trench. Behind him, the forest was silent. Somewhere in that silence, Brenner was making his own choice, a choice the story would never tell, a decision between the man he had been trained to be and the man he might still become. Werner unfolded the leaflet he had carried in his pocket since the first day the papers fell. The photograph of the prisoners still showed their relieved faces, smiling over plates of food, alive and safe and waiting to go home. He understood now that he was looking at his own future. He folded the leaflet and placed it inside his notebook, beside Haney's letter and the list of names he had kept through the darkest days. Then he looked up at the gray November sky and waited for whatever came next. For the first time in months, he was not afraid.